Yeshua was crucified because he freed the animals in the temple. The Jewish temple was a slaughterhouse. So Yeshua, he was crucified because he liberated the animals, because he thought that animal sacrifice was morally reprehensible. So he freed the animals and turned over the tables and all of that. And he was arrested and crucified for that reason. The Ebionites were vegetarians. We know this from several sources. And we know that Yeshua's disciples were vegetarian. We know that Yeshua was probably a vegetarian. John the Baptist was vegetarian. The Essenes were vegetarians. So the Ebionites were vegetarians. If you're still eating meat, knock it off. If you're still eating meat, you still think it's cool to slaughter God's innocent, defenseless creatures just so you can have some, experience some sense pleasure and get some sustenance from the suffering of others, it's time to move on. You're still doing that. Okay? Eat a vegetarian diet. That's what Yeshua taught, it's what his disciples taught, it's what the Ebionites taught, it's what the Essenes taught. The original Christian movement was a vegetarian movement. Period.
Welcome back to Radical Health. We got a very special guest today. This is Kameron Waters. Cam, how are you today?
I'm doing good, bro. I got my coconut here in your honor. I'm just getting that sweet, structured water in my system for this epic talk we're about to have.
Yeah, so that actually leads me right to the first question I had for you. You know I'm a fruit and vegetable fanatic. So what is local and in season right now in Costa Rica for you? What have you been enjoying?
Well, because it's a non-seasonal tropical rainforest, pretty much everything's in season in a sense. But right now, the pineapples in the backyard here are pumping. I try to avoid the pineapples mass-produced here because they're really bad. I'm sure you know all about that. But we got some pineapples going off. We got some star fruit. The coconuts are all the time, which is awesome. Mango season's in a good spot right now. Yeah, so I'm kind of getting bananas are going off all the time. So that's like a smoothie staple right there. Everything I just named, I'm crushing it. So it's good.
Sounds like the Garden of Eden.
It is.
It's beautiful. So Cam, there's so much stuff I want to ask you about today. I want to talk about the Beagles. I want to learn about your new projects. I wanted to go deep into scripture and some other historical texts with you. But first, let's just talk about your recent film, Christspiracy. So for anyone who doesn't know, Christspiracy is a documentary, came out 2 years ago, 2024. And it has an alternate title that's a little more palatable for some people called What Would Jesus Do? And the film essentially asks the question, how would Jesus kill an animal? And it shows all the great evidence, the overwhelming evidence that Jesus probably wouldn't kill an animal, that he and his whole crew of apostles were vegetarian, that he was literally the good shepherd who would give his life for the sheep, and that his stance against eating and sacrificing animals was one of the main reasons to storm the temple and cast out the money changers and those who sold doves, oxen, and sheep. So the film has caused quite a ripple in some of the Christian circles because it's making people question their worldview and move toward vegetarianism. And it's also making positive changes in the vegan circles because now we're seeing Jesus in a new light, a light that's a little more easy to accept. It makes more sense rather than Jesus being a blood sacrifice. So Cam, you're bringing some of these ancient truths to light in big ways. So I first want to just thank you and congratulate you on the film. But how has the response been for you to the film so far 2 years later?
Well, first, I'll start that by saying thank you for spreading the message and what you're doing. And in fact, thank you so much for some time ago how I was actually introduced to your work. Thank you for recognizing the film in your contest that you did for burgeoning or blossoming vegan movements out there with honoring the whole Nazarene tradition and the film and all of that. So yeah, I feel similar to your reaction that you were sharing back then. It's been just an overwhelming support and excitement. There's obviously the naysayers and people who are polarized really in the opposite direction for various reasons. but the overwhelming majority, to my surprise, has been positively received. Even people who don't agree yet with the premise appreciate the approach to the film, I've noticed, because my genuine story is that I genuinely and sincerely asked this question and went on this journey for myself and for my own faith. I didn't go into it with an agenda to prove anything. And then Kip, though he was farther along than me on the animal rights stuff earlier on than I was, he's always taken a genuine approach too. If you watch all of his films, he often interviews people on the other side of the argument more than people on the vegan side of the argument in the films. It's one of the funny dichotomies of, I guess, rebukes of these films, is that people will say, well, you have an agenda. You need to interview more people with an opposite opinion, or go interview. It's like, I always say, did you watch the film? Did you watch any of the films? Because we are facing up straight up with the people who completely disagree with what we're saying and asking them some of the challenging questions and getting their responses. So I think because of that, even the people that don't agree appreciate the film. But we've got 98% on Rotten Tomatoes with countless thousands of reviews, which is exciting. I think that's a higher rating than like Titanic and Avatar or something like that, which, to be fair, they have a lot more reviewers on those films. But we're doing good. I'm excited, and I want to keep spreading the message.
That's nice. And how long did you guys film for this in the making of it?
So the filming was right around a 7-year process when you really account it all. I met Kip in 2016 by a chance encounter portrayed in the film. And from that moment, we were in discussions and working on the concept. I was already writing a book with some of the research I had done and was planning on releasing it in book form. But when we met, it was like instantly, hey, we should make a film about this. And from that discussion in 2016, there was a very long kind of like delays in certain filming and, just kind of getting it off the ground, because we're doing everything as independent filmmakers on our own budgets at first and all of that. So it kind of took a little bit. But then once Netflix got involved in 2017, going into 2018, the filming really ramped up. And we were wrapped on filming right around 2021-ish, 2022. But we were already editing in that period too. And then we were trying to release. And so it took a whole year to try to figure out even how to put it out the right way, because we had to buy our rights back from Netflix because they wanted to censor the Nazarene information from the film. And we had to do a crowdfund to buy our rights back. And then we were like, oh, we can get this theater deal. And then the theaters wanted to censor the film. It was such a process. So really, give or take 2016 to 2024, I was nose to the grindstone every single day trying to get it out. So.
Wow. Hard work pays off.
Yeah.
And are you still working on that book? Do you have plans to finish or release that at any time?
Yeah, I'm working on it in the background because it took the background seat when the film was made. And now that the film's out, the film's still priority. So it's kind of like on the back burner, but I get to it when I can. The book itself was titled, and probably still be titled, Vegan Jesus, to purposely ignite some polarization with that statement. The backstory on that, funny, just to kind of like share a little bit of that, is when I started asking this question, which all started with a Daniel fast. I'm sure we can talk about that in another later question, but skipping some of that, once I was already in the flow and I was, living a lifestyle of kindness to other animals and also, plant-based diet and all of that, but feeling the rub with my scriptural tradition and faith-based tradition of being raised Christian, I found myself often getting in these arguments with people that I wasn't instigating. I was just living my lifestyle. And then other Christian peers around me would start to ask me questions about what I was eating or what I believed, and I would share my reasoning, and then it would ultimately end in or evoke argument. or just back. And when I say argument, I don't mean like conflict, but people presenting arguments and clash and disagreements. One of those big disagreements was actually when I was on tour playing music, which was my first profession. I'm a musician at heart. I know you are too, Mr. Saxman. But that was my first love, and I was a professional musician traveling around the country, and I was in a van with this band that I was playing with. And the driver of the van, who was also the band manager, would do these long stints on the road where everyone else in the van was kind of young and on their phone all the time, or they were sleeping or whatever. And I kind of felt bad for him because he was just driving by himself. So I went and sat with him in the passenger seat to like kind of help keep him awake for safety. And we're driving along and we're getting to know each other. And the more we get to know each other, when you have a long time and you start to get closer, depending on personality, sometimes people start to pick at each other and things as like a love language. He's one of those guys. And we used to get in these arguments about musical taste. And he would make fun of certain bands I liked because he was a hardcore punk rock guy at heart, and this and that. So all that to say, we had this like fun banter that we had, right? Then one day, hours and hours into a drive, he's like, "Hey man, what's the deal with this whole thing with you eating, plants and plant-based and all that? Like, we got to go out of the way. We got to drive to Chipotle so that you can get a rice dish, or we got to go to the organic thing so you can get some fruit." And it's kind of annoying. Like, what's this all about? And I mentioned to him my spiritual path with it, and kind of how I got there and my Christian background and its connection. And it was like, dude, you saw like this guy was a tatted punk rock dude who was like, we're out on the road. He's like flirting with women at the bars, probably trying to like, hook up. And he just had this kind of, but then all of a sudden he becomes uber Christian in this moment. And he's just like, "What are you talking about? The Bible doesn't say anything about that." But I'm like, "Whoa." I was like, "Are you a Christian?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Oh, wow. I didn't even know." He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "But this is heretical what you're saying," and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, "Whoa, dude, I had no idea." And so we started bantering about that. But it was funny because like when we were bantering about the music, it was all fun and games. But then when we started talking about this, there was much more aggression in the tone. And eventually we got to the place where we were able to joke about it. And so he started calling me Vegan Jesus, because at the time I had long hair and my beard for the first time. The tour before I did with them, I didn't, but I was able to finally grow a beard. I couldn't. It was like that time in my life when I could finally grow one. So I was just letting it rock. So he started calling me Vegan Jesus. So all that to say, to kind of jokingly push back at him, at one of our biggest shows at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, the day before the show, I went and got a t-shirt printer to print Vegan Jesus in bold Helvetica font on my chest. And I went out to play the show. There's actually, this is online somewhere on YouTube, but I'm playing and I'm rocking. And so from that day on, I started wearing that shirt, and people on tour started chanting Vegan Jesus like before we came out. And so I'm doing all my research. I'm talking to my cousin who's a book publisher, and he's like, "Dude, you got to publish a book on all this, and you got to name it that, and like just become that character, and it'll help you, promote the book." And so that was the original path and plan. But then I met Kip on the journey, and was like, "Nah, it's way better to make it a movie, because a picture's worth 1,000 words." So
Yeah, well, I appreciate that story. And also, fewer people are reading books these days. Although I do think they're going to make a comeback once we're all inundated and totally saturated with AI slop and the digital everything. There's always the shift back toward nature or back toward analog. And we're going to see that with books too. We've seen it with records. We've seen it with tapes and CDs, and it'll happen with books, I'm sure. In regards to the tension somewhat that you were describing with the bus driver or with the van driver, they say it's easier to convince someone to change their religion than it is to change their diet. When you combine the two, the diet and the religion, it's an impenetrable barrier for a lot of people, and they get really triggered, and they're supported by a lot of scripture and teachings from the church that teaches them how to just derail that conversation, and they don't really want to look into it. So I've also found it very challenging to speak with Christians about this topic, but I also love it because it gives me an opportunity to bring up some of the scripture that's staring us in the face. Genesis 1:29, for example, and then further along, the prophets and Jesus. I mean, the first time that I read the Gospel of Matthew, I was shocked by how much health messaging was in there, and even allusions to animals. You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel, and things like, he goes into cast out the money changers and those who sold doves. And in John, it's those who sold doves, oxen, and sheep. And so there's all these breadcrumbs, and that's what your film does a great job of doing, is exposing these breadcrumbs and shining a big light on that history. In your film, you point out the fact that all the apostles and Jesus himself were all martyred and killed for their beliefs. Is that true? And what does that say about the time period and the culture that they were living in if all of the apostles were killed for what they taught and believed?
Yeah, so martyrdom is a widely attributed and at sometimes contested fact amongst biblical scholarship. You get one thing when you're talking to certain historians, critical biblical scholars. You get another thing when you're talking to apologists of the faith and everything, because the truth be told, there's a lot of legendary development when it comes to martyr stories, right? Because over time, it's just natural when someone dies for a cause. It's easy to embellish the story to promote the cause over time. However, what both sides tend to forget around this story, or maybe just miss because they're not aware, is the reason why they're martyred. And, an apologist will tell you that it's simply just for following the faith and the teachings as we know it today in modern Christianity. And then you've got some of the critical scholars and historians who just second guess whether it even happened. And what I like to point to as one of the central pieces of evidence that shocked me when I learned about it is Pliny's letter to Trajan, Pliny the Younger. We actually have it on our sources page to support one of the factoids in our film where we talk about this martyrdom of the followers of Jesus. And what we'll talk about in this podcast, how a central tenet of the faith that's being promoted is that they're completely against animal exploitation, especially in the form of killing and consuming animals for sacrifice or consumption. And it sounds preposterous at first because we just haven't heard it widely, but this was a central document in the first century, and apologists refer to this document all the time to prove that Christians existed early when they're defending their faith against the atheists and naysayers who say that Christianity is this invented thing and it's later and whatever. They point to Pliny's letter to Trajan as their proof, because Pliny in about 111, 112 AD reports about the Christiani. It's the first actual secular instance of the word Christian that we have too, by the way. And Pliny is a kind of a general of sorts, overseeing militarily the region that's now modern day Turkey. And he's reporting to Emperor Trajan about happenings and going ons in that region. And one of the things he says is, hey, look, Trajan, and I'm going to paraphrase here in modern language, go read the letter for yourself. But he says, Trajan, look, these Christians have moved into town, and I'm really confused about who they are or what they're about. But what I do know for certain, I've gathered here, and I'm going to share it with you. They meet in their houses. They sing hymns early in the morning at sunrise. Then they pledge allegiance to each other, accountability to not do crimes rather than to do crimes, which is funny because it's almost like he's alluding to, how secret societies pledge to do crimes and not tell anyone about it. He's saying, well, they pledge these secret allegiances, but it's to not do crimes, to not steal, to not kill, to not commit adultery. And it sounds like the 10 Commandments, essentially. And then he says, after this, they meet and partake in innocent and harmless food. Now, Christian apologists who go deep enough to even discuss that will typically say, oh, well, he's just saying that because there's a rumor that Christians were cannibals because they're eating the body and blood of Jesus through the Eucharist and all of that. And he's dispelling that myth. But that argument doesn't really hold water, because immediately after that statement, he says that he started torturing some of these Christians, specifically the female deaconesses, he says. And upon torturing them, getting their information, revealing who's who, and killing the ones that are resisting, now we've seen a resurgence of the temples and the sacrificial animals, and all is good and well now in the economy in our area. And so clearly the innocent and harmless food is speaking about the temple sacrifices and the shambles, the meat markets. And this is important because then Trajan responds to him and says, essentially, approved, Pliny, great work. He does push back because Pliny's saying he gives them 3 chances to recant their beliefs. And if they don't recant, then he kills them. Trajan says, don't even give them 3 chances. Just make them do the obligations in front of you to prove their allegiance to Rome, which means sacrifice an animal. So essentially, Trajan is saying, hey, what we need to do is find these people, make them kill an animal. And if they don't, they're Christians and they need to be taken out. So this is like something that's widely happening across the empire. There's other evidence of it. Obviously with James the Just and some of the stories that we get through some of the both secular and historical record of him. The Cathars were a later group, probably influenced by the Nazarenes, who were a vegetarian Christian sect in France. Through the what's called the Albigensian Crusades, they were brutally murdered by the church because they were heretics. And there's again, this is in our sources page. There's evidence of literal priests and leaders of the church forcing the Cathars to kill chickens to prove their allegiance, and if they didn't, they were actually martyred in the middle of the city. So it's brutal, man. And most people have missed this part of our history. I feel like if I would have known this growing up, it would have made me investigate this stuff earlier too. But there's, I think, power structures maybe that don't want people to know this side of early Christian history.
Yeah, that's powerful. People aren't reading these old letters, from the 2nd century. But when we do, we find a lot of gold in there, a lot of gold nuggets. I was just reading a text, a famous heresiology or a heresiology from a 4th century bishop. And there's so much to be gleaned from that about also the sects of the Nazarenes, the Essenes, the Ebionites. And so that sort of leads me to my next question is, what can we learn from Epiphanius or Epiphanius's Panarion or Panarion? That's his heresiology of all these sects who he thinks are blaspheming and heretical to the church. And he points out what they do and why it kind of goes against the teachings of the church. But in exposing how some of these sects act and live, he exposes their lifestyle. And there's some really mind-blowing implications from this. So what are some of the big things that you took away from Epiphanius's Panarion?
Well, I love that you asked this so early in the interview, because you're getting right to the proverbial jugular, pun intended, but in a non-violent way. Fruits have jugulars, right? They have you're slicing a fruit, but no, you're getting right to the heart of the matter, I guess, should I say. This text of Epiphanius is huge. To give it a little context, I just mentioned Christiani of Pliny as the first mention of the secularly of the term Christian. But we know that before Christianity, this is actually a late term, that the earliest followers of Jesus were the Nazarenes. And we've always been told or just believed by circumstance, widely speaking around the world, that they're called that because they follow Jesus of Nazareth, that it all has to do with a place of origin of the founder of the movement. This was one of the biggest revelations of my entire time in my own research and then making the film, because the deeper I went, the more I learned, the more it shook my reality to the point where I would fight it and be like, no, that can't be true. And I would try to play devil's advocate against what I was finding. And it always continued to prove itself. To this day, I still find information that reinforces this idea that it's not Jesus of Nazareth, it's Jesus the Nazarene. And in our Bible, I challenge anyone to check this out. You can go on Bible Hub. All over the Gospels, our Greek Gospels, in our English translations, most of them will render it Jesus of Nazareth. But like if you go to the New American Standard Bible, which is kind of one of the most accurate translations we have to English, along with the English Standard Version in terms of modern English, the NASB will replace Jesus of Nazareth with Jesus the Nazarene, because that's the proper rendering from the Greek. All over the text in the Greek where we have Jesus of Nazareth in the English is actually Jesus the Nazarene or Jesus the Nazarene, two different forms. And both of them are problematic in terms of denoting a place of origin, like Nazareth. And Nazarene is completely, like, it's an impossibility based on the vowels that make up the word. It can only refer to a sectarian kind of religious title. And in fact, this is the word that's used on Jesus's sign of the crucifix, as we're told in John, that it says, you know, Jesus, King of Judea, the Nazarene. It's the Nazarene form, which is a sectarian title. So before getting to Epiphanius, what I'll say is the big revelation that occurred to me was, okay, this is a sect. Well, what does this mean for this whole town of Nazareth thing? And we uncovered in the film that the town name of Nazareth doesn't occur in any historical record until 200 years after Jesus's death in the religious record. In the secular record, it doesn't even occur until like 400 years after Jesus. So that causes some problems. Okay, why? You know, Josephus, the famous historian who documents all of the towns and little hamlets and everything in Galilee, doesn't mention Nazareth. He mentions Sepphoris, which is right next door. He does mention Jesus too. So why would he omit this? And what I believe about this is that I think the Jesus of Nazareth is potentially an unconscious or a conscious diversion from who the Nazarenes were. Now, there could have been a town named Nazareth at that time, and we just don't have record of it for whatever reason. But what I would contest is, why is it named Nazareth? The Nazarenes aren't called Nazarenes because they came from Nazareth. It's the other way around. Nazareth is named Nazareth because Nazarenes lived there. So now we get to the Nazarenes. So who are the Nazarenes and what does Epiphanius have to say about them? So this is explosively ground-shattering material. And in fact, when I present this and go straight to the heart of the matter, like we're going to here to most people, I find that debating text and scripture and all of that can sometimes be successful. Sometimes it can leave people's wheels spinning on this topic. But if you get straight to this, it's a world rocker, because it was for me. Epiphanius says in his Panorama, when he records the quote unquote Jewish sects that are the heresies, he records a few different Jewish sects. He records the Pharisees, the Sadducees, who we know from the Bible, you know, Jesus's opponents, right? He records the Herodians. He records the Hemero-Baptists, which are like perpetual Baptists who do the mikvah ceremonies and the, you know, kind of like John the Baptist, and the Nazarenes. Now, he records them with the Greek sigma, that's the S sound, Nazarean rather than Nazorean. But Epiphanius admits that he doesn't really know the spellings and the origins precisely of these groups. And what scholars now know is this is probably just a discrepancy between Aramaic and Hebrew. Aramaic is a much softer S. Hebrew is a harder Z, Netzarim sound. What the Panorama chapter 18 says about the Nazarenes is they were just like the other Hebrews, the other Israelites in almost every way, though they did claim true descendants of Israel, which is kind of interesting that he brings that up, some kind of genealogical claim. But other than that, they're just like all the other traditions, except for one difference. And that is that they do not offer sacrifice and they will not consume flesh because they believe it's unlawful to do so. And though they believe in all of the stories of the patriarchs and the prophets before them, they believe that the stories about sacrifice essentially are forged. They're forgeries into the text. They weren't original to the story. They've been added later. This is what the Nazarenes believed. Now, Epiphanius, because he's a heresiologist, like you mentioned, for anyone who doesn't know what that means, he's condemning heretics, those who don't believe exactly the way the Roman Catholic empirical tradition wants you to believe. When he's condemning them, he's very hostile. So he tries to obfuscate, and he blends up details, and he's pretty crabby too. He casts a lot of like negative kind of how would you say it? He almost like calls them nicknames, and all of this is really kind of mean, a lot of the stuff that he says. And but one of the things that he does is he tries to obfuscate these earlier Nazarenes from the later Nazarenes that followed Jesus. But again, this can all be, we don't have to do it right now, but if you want to, this is where, like you mentioned, the Ebionites, these other sects that get kind of broken apart into these individual labels after Jesus, it's really all a part of the same general movement. And their core difference is that they reject the temple cult, animal sacrifices, flesh consumption, all of that.
Yep. I'm going to read a little bit from the 18th chapter of the Panorama against Nazarenes. He says that they are Jews by nationality, and that the sect recognized as fathers the persons in the Pentateuch, like you mentioned, Cam, from Adam to Moses. However, it would not accept the Pentateuch itself. So it acknowledged Moses and believed that he had received legislation, not this legislation, though, they said, but some other. And so they recognize sort of potentially a conspiracy to cover up the original true teachings of Moses. And so that's one thing that I'm looking at when I'm reading the Bible and I say, okay, well, it says that Moses taught the people how to kill animals and that God needed it. So that means one of a few things. Either that's true and it's from God and that is a true prophet and properly recorded, or Moses did not receive that legislation and it was put in there after the fact by scribes. Or it could also mean that he received it falsely and that he's a false prophet. But it seems like these Nazarenes, according to Epiphanius, they accepted the 10 Commandments. They accepted some of the true, what they thought were true teachings of Moses, that he was a true prophet, but that the scribes stepped on it all, added a bunch, hundreds of laws and statutes to sort of round out the law. But these later sects, the Nazarenes, Essenes, Ebionites, they recognize the 10 Commandments and they don't need to do all that sacrifice. So that was chapter 18. If we go up to 30, that's against the Ebionites. And that gives us even more insight into who these people were and what these sects were. Also, just to expound on kind of what you said about the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, the Essenes, they do seem very similar because they have the similar worldviews, according to the historians. And it's almost like if we look back on today, hundreds of years in the future, and the historians are saying, oh, there was the vegans and the vegetarians and the plant-based people, and they all had these different ideas. They had the Pythagoreans and they had the raw vegans, and there's all these different sects. But at the end of the day, we all have a few very core things in common, and we're not that different.
Right.
And even today, we might not separate ourselves as much as a historian would. But can we zoom in onto against the Ebionites? Because there's even more. It's not just that they rejected sacrifice and that they rejected some of the Pentateuch, but that they rejected Paul too.
Right.
And that they had this other gospel, that they used the gospel of Matthew, but it was in Hebrew. And so can you talk to us a little bit about the gospel of the Hebrews? What does Epiphanius preserve of that? Because we don't have the full text anymore. But what does Epiphanius preserve in there? And also, do you remember what he says about Paul? Or excuse me, what the Ebionites said about Paul?
Right. So most, I think, people know, and if you don't, just to clarify for context, Christianity that we have today could maybe more aptly be named Paulianity, in the sense that, just pointing to basic facts, the Gospels are really the core teachings of Jesus in our New Testament. And even in the Gospels, you've got the red letters of Jesus, and then you've got historical content added onto it. But then following that, you've got a ton of letters from Paul, this apostle that claimed to be someone who received a vision from Jesus on the famous road to Damascus. And then he's got a story through the telling of the book of Acts where he's trying to, interpret this with the Jerusalem church, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, John, the actual disciples that walked with Jesus in the flesh. And we can see that tension even in our own scripture. It's an argument probably for a whole other podcast. And a lot of people orate on that. Just look up these tensions if you want for yourself, but it's there in our modern canon. But one of the things that people often miss, even in our modern canon, is often they think the disagreement is just around like circumcision or following the law, the Torah, in this broad sense of all these liturgical laws and everything, like you mentioned, that these, James the Just and these leaders were trying to follow this massive Pentateuch that we have now. However, when you look at Paul's writings, often when he's writing to these churches in Ephesus or Corinth or Galatians famously, he's having all these, Romans as well, he has these disagreements about eating flesh, about eating animals, oftentimes framed around eating meat sacrificed to idols as the primary point of contention, and that he's saying it doesn't matter if it's sacrificed to idols. But we also see evidence that it's not just about meat sacrificed to idols in a number of places we can get into, but essentially this is a big point of contention. Famously in Romans, he says the weak only eat vegetables. He's talking about either his own opinion or at least an opinion within the growing church that some people say eat only plant-based. Other people say you can eat whatever in the meat market, as he says, without raising any questions of conscience. And when you learn what we're about to talk about with the Ebionites in this tradition, like the Nazarenes, Paul's referring to the Jerusalem church. He's referring to James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who, according to 5 or more church fathers, ate no flesh since his birth, since his mother's womb. So Paul's having a tension with these people. Now, knowing that context from our own scripture, and you read this reading about the Ebionites from Epiphanius, and understanding that Ebionite is just a kind of Greco-Romanized to English transliteration of the Hebrew word Ebionim, which just means the poor, just like Paul was told to remember the poor when he was preaching, and they're referred to like they're a congregation. The congregation of the Ebionim, the poor, is all over the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was a internal or external designation for the Nazarene movement. And when Epiphanius is encountering these Ebionites, he's reporting that they are highly against consuming animals. And like you said, highly against Paul, most likely because Paul is the one who's trying to create an acceptance of animal eating around the Greco-Roman world, either with the intention of making it more palatable for people, or maybe he's got an intention to twist that narrative. Who knows? I don't want to put too much intention there, but it's again a whole other conversation. But essentially, this is all historically attested. Scholars agree on this. Every early Christian scholar worth their salt refers to what's called the parting of the ways, which is Paul's thread versus the thread of the Jerusalem church and James and the original disciples. And it's primarily over this issue. So Epiphanius is talking about this church of the poor, and he says that they have this Hebrew gospel. He refers to it as the gospel of the Ebionites because he's referring to them, but we have numerous other church fathers, including the famous Jerome, who is the father of the modern Bible, attesting that the gospel of the Ebionites is the same gospel used as the gospel of the Nazarenes, and it's the Hebrew gospel of Matthew, which he states in his words is believed to be the authentic Matthew, meaning the earliest Matthew, literally penned by Matthew himself. So when Epiphanius, in his, like I mentioned, he's he is a hired gun by the Roman Church to create these heresiologies. He's got patrons that are paying him to write against these heresies. And so he's reporting on these Ebionites, and he says they have this Hebrew gospel, and in it there are manipulations to the text that don't agree with our text, right? That's how he frames it, that they've mutilated their gospel. We know that most likely he's just referring to the original Matthew and what the original text said, and he's trying to paint it as if it's a twisting of the scripture when it's actually the original scripture. And two of the sayings that he preserves is that Jesus said, I have no desire to eat the flesh of Passover with you, meaning the Passover lamb for the Passover ritual, which we know in our Gospels, Jesus performs as the Last Supper, and all that's mentioned is bread and grape juice, essentially, no lamb. But then he says, Jesus also said, I have come to abolish the sacrifices. Unless you cease sacrificing, wrath will not cease from you. So when you put those pieces together, this fits the description of the Nazarenes we mentioned, the earlier Hebrew sect that looks like it even predated Jesus. He also mentions about the Ebionites that when he questions them, upon asking them why they follow this tradition, how they learn to eat only vegetables and to abhor the eating of flesh, one of them answers, because Christ taught us to. Essentially, I'm kind of paraphrasing in modern language, but he says Christ revealed it to me, but that was a way of saying it was just a message from Christ. That's why we do it. Christ being Messiah, being Yeshua, being Jesus, right? So yeah, as far as their contention with Paul, you may even be able to elaborate on this more, because it's been a while since I've read that particular section, but it's very clear that he notes one of his biggest contentions with them is that they reject Paul and the teachings of Paul. But this is really a mirror of a kind of quote unquote gospel version or New Testament version of the Nazarenes in their Hebrew Bible or Pentateuch that we just discussed. So they believe that the Nazarenes, like you said, they believe in Moses, they believe he's a prophet, but they reject this sacrifice flesh consumption aspect of the scripture specifically. And it angers Epiphanius so much that in the Nazarene section, he says, well, didn't Abraham offer a ram? And what does he say? Noah was given all meats to eat. It's funny because it's the same argument still used today when you bring this up from modern Christians about meat eating, but he's doing the same arguments. Similarly, in the Ebionite section, you've got the same thread of people, but now they're not just contending with the false scribes or the false potential words of the Pentateuch, but the false words of the gospel. And to them, Paul is the one who's at the heart of a lot of these quote unquote forgeries of the faith, if you will, or the parting of the ways of the original intention. So they're saying, yeah, we don't follow Paul because we don't believe in animal consumption, and we reject eating meat sacrificed to idols and all these things that he's kind of being lackluster about. So that's Panarion 30.
Yep.
It's a long section, man. There's so much in there. It's like I almost want to revisit it, every year, a couple times a year, and I catch something new, So
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And it's 30, section 16.8. He says that the Essenes are not ashamed to accuse Paul with certain fabrications.
There you go.
Yeah, and we run into that today. Like we start questioning some of the things Paul said. Oh, you can eat meat sacrificed to idols? Well, here it says that we shouldn't. And we get accused of being heretics. Oh, if you throw out Paul, you have to throw out the whole New Testament. And it's this whole slippery slope fallacy that people accuse us of. But hey, if it's good enough for Jesus, good enough for me. That's what I say. And so if him and his people and the people that followed him did not accept certain teachings, then I think it's okay to at least question them. You know what I mean? We don't have to just blindly follow and say, okay, I won't look at those, but let's leave things open to be critiqued, questioned, and see, does it line up with the capital T truth here? The quote of Jesus preserved here in the Panarion that says, according to the Essenes, Jesus came and instructed us to abolish the sacrifices, and that their so-called gospel says, I came to abolish the sacrifices, and if you cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you. That's very, very powerful. because the implication of the sentence, I came to abolish the sacrifices. He doesn't say I came to die for your sins, because that could be a different way to say it. Well, what sins are we talking about here? The sacrifices. So did he really come for one particular purpose, to abolish this abominable, practice of burning animals alive, slitting their throats, throwing blood around the altar, stuff that seems overtly demonic and satanic when you just look at it with your plain eyes. There's no amount of religious frill or dressing that could make that seem like, oh yeah, that's chill. Like I'll do that with you next Sabbath or whatever. That animal sacrifice was such a big thing back then, and it was central to the temple. And it really brings up this question of, was Jesus sent literally for this one purpose, which was to throw a wrench in the gear of that system? What do you think? Do you think that was his main purpose, or, why do you think Jesus was sent here?
When you just said that, I just got chills up my spine, because though I've looked at that preserved passage so many times, and it's literally in our film, and I read it hundreds of times while I was editing it, I never thought of it like that. That's so clear as day. And I get asked this a lot, and I get challenged by this a lot, and I get painted heretically a lot by people saying, oh, well, he's the guy, or I'm the guy that says Jesus came and died for the animals. And very specifically, if you see in the film, I interview a Hebrew scholar, particularly around some of Jesus's words in the temple that we can talk about later. The den of thieves incident, when he addresses them in the Gospels. When I ask the Hebrew scholar, I always point to people who paint me that way. And I say, hey, if you go watch the film, check out what I say to the scholar, because when she reveals that Jesus is essentially calling the temple priests and everyone involved with animal sacrifice a den of murderers, of violent ones, which this Hebrew Oxford scholar attests in the moment is the proper reading, I say, so are you saying that Jesus didn't come just for humans, but to save animals as well? Kind of like a 2-for-1, But you saying that, I mean, ultimately, removing animal sacrifice and everything by extension is a salvific action towards humans, because wrath will continue to come on us. But that particular, I came to abolish the sacrifices, that's it. Man, that's really powerful. I hadn't really let the words sink in the way that you just orated them with that point. But I'll reinforce it actually by going back a little bit, and I'm gonna weave a little bit here, but I want to paint a few things together, because you mentioned the Essenes in Epiphanius's work there, which, funny enough, he talks about the Essenes as Jessians, which there's a reason behind that. So let me paint this picture. So for those listening who, like me, and were you raised Christian? I can't remember, Christian or synagogue. Okay, well, you know this, but just so that people know from my background, that I was raised that the Bible, the Word of God, was God's infallible truth, and that every single letter and word is truth, and there's nothing corrupted about it. And so it was really a hard pill for me to swallow if I would have heard what we're talking about right now just 10 years ago, But one piece that I want to throw out there that's important, rather than just even talking about what a church father's saying about these groups, let's look at our own Hebrew Bible right now, the Old Testament for Christians. And in the mouth of the prophet Jeremiah, in chapter 8, verse 8, he says, who are we to think that we have the law, the Torah, meaning the written word of God that they were reading and orating in their time in their churches? Who are we to think we have the law of the Lord, when the lying pen of the scribes has falsified it? Now, Christians will try to make that mean that it was the scribes living out the law improperly, and their bad example is what was falsifying the law. Or maybe even they were orating it to the people in a bad way or an improper way, or twisting it with their little oral words. But the problem is, Jeremiah says, it's the pen of the scribes, the lying pen. It's a very specific word in Hebrew. That's the device that you write the scripture with. So he's condemning these priests and these scribes for falsifying the Torah. Now, in Jeremiah's mouth as well, in chapter 7, verse 22, he says, speaking for God on his behalf, "For when I brought your fathers out of Egypt, I didn't speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. For this I said, love God, be obedient, yada, yada, yada." But he's very direct. God didn't command sacrifices when you were brought out of Egypt, which is actually specifically the Passover is the moment they were brought out of Egypt, which is the celebration that Jesus is confronting in the temple at Passover week. So I say all that to say, in the Jessean piece that I want to bring in, is in the way that I highlighted, or that we're highlighting, the Nazarenes were this pre-Christian sect, according to Epiphanius, but of the Hebrew faith, Hebrew heretics. Jeremiah also mentions the Nazarenes, but he says, "From the hills of Ephraim, the Nazarene will cry out." It's a people group title. It's a plural title of a group of people. It gets translated into our English as the Watchers, or the Guardians, which is one way to translate the word. We'll talk about the other way in a second. But if it's the keepers, the guardians, all throughout our Bible, it talks about those who guard the law. What law, though? Which law, right? Well, if you start to understand that the Nazarenes, the Netzarim, as Epiphanius is describing, they're keeping or they're guarding some other legislation from Moses, right? Well, Jesus quotes Jeremiah like crazy. He's one of his favorite prophets. He's quoting him when he called the temple priests a den of murderers, of parites. That's Jeremiah 7:11, when Jeremiah is condemning the temple cult as well. But the other half of that statement, when Jesus is condemning the priests, he says, "It is written, my house is meant to be a house of prayer for all nations." Funny enough, that word nations can also be interpreted creatures, because ethnos, it's a group of people or a herd of animals. But you've made it a den of murderers. Den is also an ancient word for, and still to this day, where animals, a place for keeping animals, right? The lion's den. So he's essentially saying, it is written that my house is meant to be a house of prayer, but you've made it into a place for all creatures, but you've made it into a den, a lair of murderers killing the animals there. But that first half, my house is meant to be a house of prayer, which is clearly in complete juxtaposition to it being a house of bloody sacrifice. That's Isaiah, the great prophet Isaiah, who is one of the other favorite prophets that Jesus quotes. And famously, Jesus's vision of the kingdom of heaven seems to have its origin and its root. Mostly scholars agree because he quotes the Isaiah scroll at the beginning of his ministry, setting the oppressed free, freedom for the captives. I'm declaring this is now the day of the Lord's favor. That's Isaiah. He loved Isaiah. And in fact, I like to argue, similar to the apologists, but in a different way, apologists often say that Isaiah is the fifth gospel, before the gospel. I think Isaiah was kind of like a gospel in Jesus's time. It was this new word, this new revelatory piece of scripture that people were running around saying, whoa, look at this. Why? Because all throughout it, you have this vision of the kingdom of heaven that's very near. And it's described in Isaiah 11 as the wolf laying with the lamb, the lion eating straw like the ox, this peaceable kingdom, even between predator and prey relationships, that's annihilated and that it's now peace. And even the animals turn back to eating plants, like the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1:30. The humans are giving the plant-based diet in Genesis 1:29, and animals are given a plant-based diet in Genesis 1:30. And then it says, they shall not hurt or destroy, which I'm not going to get into it fully, but the Hebrew root of destroy there is actually slaughter, on my holy mountain, which is the temple. So Jesus is evoking this idea in the temple of the great prophet Isaiah. Well, interestingly, at the beginning of that chapter, Isaiah 11, where this whole vision of the kingdom of heaven is laid out, it says, from the stump of Jesse, there will be a branch, a shoot. The Hebrew word is netzer. It's a botany term for those fruit people out there that love the channel for all the fruit knowledge, you might know that tree grafting, you can take a branch of a tree, and certain trees, you can either graft it into a new tree, or sometimes you can even plant them in the ground and they'll grow a whole new tree. That's the idea, is that there's this tree of this original faith, but a branch that comes off of that tree is going to be removed and planted, and it's the new tree. It's going to establish the true root and restore the original idea of the tree, right? So that word netzer is another root of Nazarenes. And interestingly, it says from the stump of Jesse, right? Which is a genealogical term of Jesse, who's one of the patriarchs in the lineage as well, and the line of King David and all of that. Epiphanius mentions the Jesseans. And he says that the Christians, before they were called Christians, they were called Nazarenes. But for a short time before that, they were called Jesseans. And if you look at the Greek spelling that he's using for Jessean, it's essentially the same spelling and definitely the same phonetics as Essene, Essioi. And so what I tend to think is that while there might be patriarchal, if that's a word, patriarchal, and genetic lineage here with Jesse and the Netzarim, it's also the Essioi, the Essenes and the Netzarim. So to your point about all these sects and all these groups, there's this original movement of these Essioi, these Essenes, that are going back to the essence of the faith. And within that, a Nazarene stream rises up who really hammers this sacrifice point, and particularly the kingdom of heaven is now. And so we see the other side of that coin in the Gospels. People often say, well, to me, when they think I'm speaking something heretical, they say, well, if it's not Jesus came to die for our sins, then what's the gospel then? I thought that was the gospel. And I say, well, wait a minute. When you look in all the gospels, when Jesus says he's come to declare the good news, which is gospel, that's the word, gospel. He says, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's the gospel. That's what he says is the gospel. And that's the other side of the coin. The kingdom of heaven is here, and it's waiting for us to bring it on earth as it is in heaven, in the way that Isaiah prophesied with the wolf laying with the lamb. I came to abolish the sacrifices has to be the other side of that coin, because this is the hindrance to the manifestation of the kingdom of heaven on earth. We're still participating in this horrific, blood, magic, thirsty, carnal system, thinking it's what God wants. But our greatest prophets are saying he never commanded it. Get rid of this. I'm abolishing this so that the kingdom which is at hand can manifest.
Woo! Man, I love it. And I totally agree. People ask me, what do we do about all these crazy psychos running the planet and all the, eating babies? Like, there's nothing we can do about it. And my opinion is turn inside and look at what you are doing. Look at what we're doing. Right. And honestly, leaving the animals alone is the first step, because humans are not going to leave the other humans alone until we actually look at other animals and start to develop love for them as well. And a love that says, don't kill and eat their corpses.
Right.
And so you were talking about Isaiah 11. This is one of the most beautiful chapters in the entire Bible. I'm just going to read some of it. This is 11:1. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. That word branch is netzer. That's where we get the word Nazarene. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord, and shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. With righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth. And that was Jesus's strongest thing, was his mouth, his teaching. And with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, faithfulness the girdle of his reins. And then it goes right into the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the kid, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. This is one of the most beautiful prophecies of Jesus, and it connects that branch from the stump of Jesse straight to freeing all the animals, and animals living in a world where we don't kill them and they don't even kill each other. That's That's something that a lot of people can't even quite imagine. You think a cat will live off fruits and vegetables? It's like, well, I heard you say this, Cam, is that you thought about how dogs went from this more bloodthirsty version of like wolves, and now we've seen them, how they've become and how they've evolved over time, domesticated, and it wasn't the longest living dog a vegetarian. Like, so they do thrive on plants, and we can see species evolve to be less hostile and violent and carnivorous. And so if that is the proof of concept, then I'm here for it. And I think that Genesis 1:30 probably is ultimately going to come to pass or come back around again.
100%. And if I could add to that, yes, the dog is a great example. We see evidence of this with polar bears, probably one of the most carnivorous animals on the planet. As we speak right now, there are polar bears being found who are now omnivorous because they're moving out of the ice and they're finding other sources of food and starting to incorporate plant foods into their diet. Their hair is actually changing from white to brown because, genetically speaking, it's proving that they're just kind of a adaptation off of the species of brown bear or grizzly bear that got stuck in the ice with no food sources other than meat. So they became carnivorous. And then the grizzly bears and the brown bears are probably an adaptation from a more plant-based, because what we have koalas and you know all that. So my whole point is it's totally possible that this is the case, and especially through true human stewardship in the case of dogs, right? Because it was the relationship with man that formed the species of dogs that we have. And my big revelation was, you know, I'm contemplating this Isaiah prophecy all the time in my life, and I was kind of faced with the battle of funny enough, it was all instigated, this thought process, by listening to Alex O'Connor, the famous atheist orator who challenges a lot of the biblical narratives and everything. And he brought up the problem of suffering, one of the greatest, I guess, atheist debates against the existence of God. Like, if it truly is a God, why is there all this suffering on the earth? But he said, hey, I want to take it a step further. I don't even think that's the good argument. The good argument is, why is there all this suffering on the earth absent humans? Like, when there's no human present, why is there lions mauling gazelles in the savannah? Like, couldn't God create a system where that isn't the way they cull populations and everything? Couldn't there be some, you know, reproductive thing or whatever? And I sat with that. I was like, man, that's a really good point. And it's totally solved by Genesis 1:30, that animals actually weren't created to be that way, and solved by Isaiah 11, that they're intended to return to that state. But how could I talk to someone like Alex O'Connor, who's so scientifically minded, and get them to believe that? Because they're not going to believe it because I said some scripture. So then I started to find these examples, right? But then bringing it back to the scripture, one of the recent things that I came across that's just inspired me beyond all belief is I always had this intuition. If this is possible, and if I brought this to scale, like, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at my dog, who is a genetic wolf in his, you know, ancient heritage, but if I put him in a pen with a lamb, he's not going to eat the lamb. So he is the Isaiah vision. But how does that scale worldwide to all these other animals? And I started to think, you know what, like, what if we as humans, because we are the seed bearers, we are the be fruitful and multiply, we have this capacity, you know, to see the colors of fruits, understand the seeds, save them for later with our conceptual kind of abstraction of time and all of this. We are the orderers of the garden. Is it our responsibility to grow the food in such abundance that eventually, imagine that the entire Sahara, the grasslands, everything, we start growing non-seasonal food forests. And if lions are in the savannah and their choice is, all right, I'm going to spend a lot of energy and chase this gazelle, maybe not get it, or there's a huge forest right here with jackfruit just dripping off the tree, and I can just go eat my fill and lay down and chill. What do I want to do? they're definitely, especially animals who are very much more for energy conservation than even we as humans are, they're going to choose that option. Now, here's the thing. There is a lost saying of Jesus that I recently came across on happenstance while reading Against Heresies. Again, another anti-heretical work by Irenaeus, one of the earliest church fathers. This particular saying, he is not orating it or preserving it for any heretical purpose. He's preserving it because he said, wait a minute, here's this saying. He's commenting on Isaiah, actually, on this passage of Isaiah 11. And he says, well, interesting about this passage, there is this saying that I've had passed down to me from Polycarp, who said he heard it from John, who said he heard it from Jesus himself. And if you want to pull it up, it's Against Heresies 33.5. You could type in Against Heresies 33.5. So that's book 33, I guess chapter 5. Essentially, Jesus is describing this kingdom of heaven vision and how it could play out in such a way that in the kingdom of heaven, humans, through turning to their plant-based foods and ideals, will grow such an abundance of fruits. And he uses the example of grapes and the example of grain, proper grain, in bread, that then the animals will turn to this food as well and return to their state.
Bro, I love that. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and it makes total sense because I've seen cats, the farm cats that were living on the farm that I was staying on a couple of years ago. They loved rotten avocados. They loved when they wouldn't eat a fresh one that I like to eat. They weren't too into it, but once it got a little brown, a little stinky, a little musty, I threw it on the ground and they went and attacked the thing, and they would clean the shell of the avocado.
Wow.
They also loved coconuts. So those are two fatty foods, right? So obviously it's a little closer to the animals they're used to eating. And so maybe that's just a bridge toward their plant-based abilities that will be unlocked in the future.
Yeah.
What was that you just said? I cut you off, or I couldn't hear you.
No, I said 100%. Yeah, it's totally showing how that transformation could be possible. And even cats, cats are even more so carnivorous than dogs are in their omnivory. And there's a big question around like taurine and stuff with cats, right? There's a lot of that talk, but you can go online and find groups of people who raise cats totally vegetarian, vegan, and have great success with it. In fact, there was even there's a famous vegetarian lion who was raised from birth. I forget his name or her name, but she got famous for it, and totally fine, actually had a great long lifespan, totally healthy, completely raised vegetarian. And in my home state of Georgia, just north of you there in Florida, there's the famous Noah's Ark Animal Sanctuary, which has a lion, tiger, and a bear, oh my, all living together in one space, one enclosure. And they are friendly with each other because they were all raised together to be that way. So it shows human stewardship and guidance really helps the animals in their own development. It's like they're not predetermined by their genes, and we know all this through modern science, like morphic resonance, sometimes called morphogenetic resonance, that we're not determined by our genetics, our traits. It's actually more that we're determined by the patterns, the habitual patterns that we in our species conduct, and that those shift in those patterns can happen at the drop of a pin. Maharishi effect, 100th monkey theory, all of this points in this direction, that once a certain percentage of a species shifts a habit, it updates almost like a software update of the whole species. So they take on that trait without ever having been taught it. So that's another example of how it could actually happen a lot faster than we even believe. We're not talking about like millions of years of progression of transformation that we have to do right now. Like, we could make this happen fast if everybody just wakes up,
Yeah, this is incredible. I'm going to read a little bit of the Against Heresies that you just mentioned. Who's the author of this?
Irenaeus, the church father, like one of the earliest, and he's
Okay.
recorded Polycarp's message that he heard John say that Jesus said. And it is a long whole chapter there. So if you need me to help you find it, I can locate it. It's about halfway down.
No, I found a good quote here. This is in chapter 33, section 4. There is no section 5 in the version I got, but what I have here is, nevertheless, in the resurrection of the just, the word shall also apply to those animals mentioned, for God is rich in all things. And it is right that when the creation is restored, all the animals should obey and be in subjection to man, and revert to the food originally given by God. For they had been originally subjected in obedience to Adam, that is, the productions of the earth. But some other occasion, and not the present, is to be sought for showing that the lion shall then feed on straw. And this indicates the large size and rich quality of the fruits. For if that animal, the lion, feeds upon straw at that period, of what a quality must the wheat itself be, whose straw shall serve as suitable food for lions? So it's very interesting. And you're totally right about the environment shaping how we act, because you're talking about the polar bears who lived in the Arctic or whatever, are now migrating now that it's getting warmer. They're changing, they're adapting, they're eating more plants. Same thing happened to humans, right? Humans coming out of the ice age, again, we were white and very pale, just like the polar bears. Coming out of the ice age, we get darker, we get less violent because food's not so scarce. Right. In a tropical environment, food is literally dripping from trees wherever you go. All you have to do to find food is open your eyes in many of these tropical places, and subtropical too, and temperate zones if we know how to steward the land like you're talking about. So it's so important for us to take this seriously, steward the land for ourselves, but then watch it ripple out into the greater ecosystem.
Well, speaking of that rippling, so that bit that you just read is the second half of Jesus' saying. I know because I've read it quite so many times now. It is at the bottom, what you just read of Against Heresies, book 33, chapter 5. So go check it out. But look just above. You don't have to pull it up. I can just paraphrase what leads that statement. What he's doing is he's commentating on Isaiah, and as he's orating there in what you just read, explaining how these animals could turn to the plant foods. But what he says leading up to it is he says, in the days of the kingdom, that there will be so many lands and vineyards of grapes. And in every vineyard, there will be thousands of vines. And in every vine, there will be thousands of branches. And in every branch, there will be thousands of clusters of grapes. And in every cluster, they will be crying out, pick me, bless the Lord through me, it says. And then he goes on to say, there will be thousands of crops of grain. And within every crop, there will be thousands of plants. And with every plant, there'll be thousands of heads. And so you get the picture. He's expressing this exponential abundant quality of plant-based foods to multiply on a upward curve, where everybody's talking about the insane curve of AI right now. It's learning from itself, and it's exponentially curving up so that we can't even keep track of the rate of growth. You think that's exponential? Check out the plant kingdom. Within every fruit, you get however many seeds. Some of them stone fruits, you get one, but a lot of fruits, like a watermelon, I mean, look at the number of seeds in there. You get to enjoy one fruit, and then that fruit spreads, and you grow potentially 100 more plants if they all survive, And so the exponential quality that goes on over time, it doesn't take very long for 2 to become 4, to become 8, to become, you know what I mean? So he's describing this exponential quality. And I think that's really exciting too, because I think it's literal in the sense of what we can do in a literal sense, but it's also metaphorical in that Maharishi effect meets 100th monkey theory meets, we can choose the kingdom now with every little action. And like Jesus said, it's a mustard seed. It's the tiniest of all seeds, but it grows into the biggest of all plants and trees really quickly. So it's imperative that we choose the small decision now and watch the ripple effect that it has.
I love that, because people can get so doomer minded these days. Like I kind of alluded to earlier, people are looking around at the world. There's a lot of violence, a lot of struggle, and they're having a hard time with it. And to me, what I love about the teachings of Jesus and having him as my teacher, I don't worship him. I listen to him and I try to follow him. But what's great about his teachings is he teaches you how to repent, be a better person, treat people around you better, and that will ripple into your environment. That makes people around you have an easier life, a more fulfilling, happier life. And the same goes for how we treat animals. And I think people just need to get over the fact that they get triggered by the word vegan. Like I did for a long time. I went vegan when I was 35 years old. Yeah. So that was pretty late in the game for some people. And I was like the biggest meat eater, man. I loved it. I would make fun of vegans. I would even make fun of Jesus and the church and everything, but I didn't really understand everything. I didn't have all this information. So that's why I'm doing what I do, try to get this information out there, because when you get down to it and you look at all the evidence that's there, it's really not strange to say make Christians vegan again. Like people get so triggered by your hat. They're like, yeah, they never were, Genesis 9, all this stuff. But when you look at all the evidence, it's plain as day. It's plain as day. Jesus literally was the good shepherd, and he charges us to do that too. I wanted to bring up something similar in Jeremiah, because you talked about Jeremiah 8, where he warns about the lying pen of the scribes. And in Jeremiah 7, he says numerous times, you believe in lying words. Don't believe in these lying words. Right before he goes and says, God never commanded sacrifice. He never wanted burnt offerings. And did you know that the first vision Jeremiah has is of an olive tree? It's of a plant. And God charges him to plant. So in Jeremiah 1, God's charge to Jeremiah is to plant. It says, this is Jeremiah 1:9. The Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth. The Lord said unto me, behold, I put my words into your mouth. I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms to root out, to pull down, to destroy, and to throw down, to build and to plant. And we all know that in order to plant a garden, you got to uproot all the other stuff. You have to kill some plants in order to tend your garden. It's just part of it. But right. Continuing on, Jeremiah 1:11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see the rod of an almond tree. And then said the Lord unto me, you have seen well, and I will hasten my word to perform it. So the planting and the plants and the symbolism to the garden, which is how the Bible opens, God creates the world, he creates the heavens, separates the waters, makes man, plants a garden. Then from that point on, it's just endless allusions to the garden, the fig tree, the almond tree, the branch. Right. And then conversely, whenever the people are backsliding and they're living out of alignment with God, there's these metaphors and images to the fig tree drying up, and their gardens being besieged and all their fruit being consumed by other people. And it's like the garden really is I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but the garden is such a strong symbol in the Bible and in these ancient texts that it also has a literal angle to it as well, where I do think that's literally our charge, is to be the stewards of the earth so that kingdom of heaven can manifest. Because in the kingdom of heaven on earth, there are no slaughterhouses. Okay, there's grapevines, there's passion fruit vines, there's granadilla dripping everywhere, there's coconuts, there's bananas, there's papayas, there's endless. And to your point about the seeds of the watermelon, that's what I had today for lunch. And I spit out, 30 seeds of just this one small bowl of watermelon. I still have 4/5 of it in the fridge. 30 seeds, at least. I swallowed probably 25 of them too. I can go plant 30 more vines of watermelon. So I think I'm just so excited about the garden symbolism and the garden reality that is given to us in the Bible. And people don't pick up on all the allusions to the branch and the trees and this and that, but it's so central. Is there anything else you want to add on to that?
Yeah, you just so poetically teed up a concept that I've been kind of playing with that's on the fringe of even my own research and theories. I'll put it at that. So I'm not going to hang my my hat you mentioned on it fully, but I think it's got some legs. And funny enough, it's related to your statement about making Christians vegan again being such a triggering thing. I alluded so far, or we alluded so far in this conversation, that, you know, the Nazarenes clearly rejected animal sacrifice and flesh consumption. Like I said, Pliny, the first Christians on record from a secular source, were rejecting animal sacrifice and eating simple and harmless food. And Genesis 1:29, if you go all the way back, was vegan. So make Christians vegan again totally is a accurate statement. But in terms of the garden symbolism and the branches and everything, something I've been playing around in my mind with quite a lot, and I just keep coming back to it, and you've just brought me there again, is the word Nazarene, that it comes from a branch, a netzer, right? And really, it's a specific kind of young growth is what it means. It means to spring forth. Now, similarly, we know that the Nazarenes, primarily from historical record, outside of their time in Jerusalem and the Jerusalem church, ended up in the Transjordan, probably preceded the Jerusalem stuff in the Transjordan, you know, during the time after Moses as well. And there's tribes established there. The Tetrarchy of the Nazarene is an indication from Pliny the Elder of a region in Lower Syria, Upper Transjordan, that goes all the way back to probably the 100 BC or earlier, 200 BC. And just south of this area where these Nazarenes were was the kingdom of the Nabateans, all the way back to the 4th, 5th century BC. And they were an Arab population of just wilderness dwellers. They wanted to live in the wilderness. They didn't like cities. They did eventually build Petra, the famous monument that you've probably seen on like Instagram travel pages with the huge doors. A lot of Tartarian ancient world researchers refer to it because it's carved into stone. It's epic. But this Nabatean kingdom is famous for taking the dry desert and turning it into this abundant paradise of plants. Their aquifer systems, the stories that Strabo and some of the early historians have of like when you rolled up in there, it was like you were just rolling into this epic garden oasis that just sprung forth out of the desert. And there are even ancient historians that say that these Nabateans preferred or subsisted mainly on plants. The way that they worded it is they made little use of meat, is what it said. Now, that sounds like maybe they had a little, but interestingly, ancient historians said the same about Pythagoreans, that they made little use of meat. So it's probably an ancient way of saying that they were vegan or vegetarian, that they didn't use it, because they can't even imagine not using meat. So they say like, oh, they probably just use it a little bit. All that to say, it's this ancient kingdom out in the same region, but it's the Arab populations of these movements rather than the ancient Israelite Hebrew populations, like the Ishmael strand, if you will, whatever. Nabatean is a word that goes back in their language, connected through the Aramaic, but also Arabic tongue. And it too, its root word, nabati, means to spring forth, the shoot, the branch, the plant that springs forth. Same meaning as netzarim. Now, you can even see it in the spelling. It's like just two consonants difference. Guess what? To this day, if you go to the Arab world and try to find vegan food, you're looking for nabati food. It's the word for vegan in Arabic still. So my proposition is this: netzarim, or netzer, meaning the plant, is an ancient way of saying the plant-based people. The same way today vegetarian or vegan, veg comes from vegetation or vegetable. Netzer is essentially an ancient way of saying a young vegetable or growth of a plant. They were the plant people. It's like another word for vegan. So, and I think it's literal and symbolic at the same time. So it's like, I think they've probably used it in that way, where it's like, hey, we believe in turning to this Edenic ideal in our foods and our systems, but how you do anything is how you do everything. What happens here in the physical is replicated and represented in the spiritual or the metaphysical, right? And so this idea of abundance and teaching people how the world works through these symbols of trees and seeds, the mustard seed, all of that is so bound together in our psychology and the ability to bring that kingdom forth in the physical. So I think it means both. You know, they're using these botany terms to describe their heritage and what's to come, but that's also what they participate in the physical reality. Hey, we are the people who plant the netzers, and we are trying to grow this kingdom.
That's amazing. The connection there between Nazari, Nazarene, Netzer, the branch, and Nabati. That's literally today the word we use for vegan food or vegetarian food. I think that's a home run, especially considering that Netzer means branch and Nabati means vegetarian food. And you also made me think of this. This could be a stretch, but I speak a little bit of German, and there is a letter in German called the Sz, which is two S's together, and it looks like a B. And so I'm thinking, okay, what are the connections between Naba, Nasa, B, and S? I'm like, in German, there is this very similar character. It looks like an uppercase B, and you pronounce it as two S's. You can write the same word like Fußball, which means football, like Fuss or Fusz. And so there's even another deeper possible connection, because I'm not sure. We're talking German here now, introducing into the Aramaic and Hebrew side of things, but there's a possible thread that you could pull.
That's interesting. Connor of Old World Florida brought up something similar. I don't know if it was German, if it was that or something else, but I mentioned this to him when I was hanging out with him about the etymology on Nabatean and its connection to potentially Nazarene. And he said, oh yeah, S's definitely can become B's over time. I did some research on it as well, and definitely it is a linguistic shift that can happen. But what you just made me think of, saying that it's two S's, makes me think of the Nassim or the Nassians. There's an ancient, in the heresiologies, a group of Nassims which seem very similar to the Nazarenes, but it's spelled Nasseme or Ene. I can't remember, but it's the two S's in the middle. So to your point, it's like, you know, language is interesting, and the morphology over time happens. But when you start to follow the threads, it's like, okay, we have a lot of interesting linguistic connections, but is it connected? Well, let's look deeper. Where do we look deeper? What are the practices? But the practices align, the regions align. So I think there's a lot to it. I think there's some legs to it.
Very cool. Very cool. Ken, there's so much I want to ask you, brother. We'll have to do another interview, another talk sometime. I don't want to take you forever, but I'd love to maybe move into the Bible a little bit and just talk about some classic scriptures and also the Bible as a whole. You mentioned the NASB and the ESV earlier. Is there a translation that you prefer? Or if someone's starting to read the Bible, what translation would help them, do you think, the most?
I typically tell people to use concordances more than anything. I mean, it depends on how motivated, I guess, someone is to really get to the truth. If you just kind of want to read something and not spend too much time, I do think the NASB and the ESV has a closer literal reading, but it gets it wrong sometimes too. But you just kind of want to be careful. And in fact, if you've got a verse that you're honing in on, that you're like, I'm not sure about the meaning of this, definitely pump it in the search bar and pull up, you know, Bible Hub or whatever comes up, because it'll bring up all the different translations so you can kind of compare. Because for instance, we've been mentioning Jeremiah 7:22 a bunch, that God never spoke, or God did not speak to your fathers or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. That's the reading pretty much in every single rendering of every translation, except the NIV, which unfortunately is what most modern Christians use, the New International Version. And it says that Jeremiah said that God said, I did not just command your fathers concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. So it adds this kind of qualifier there to make it sound like, oh, I did command it, but it wasn't just that. And that's a complete twisting of the scripture. It changes the meaning entirely. So you'll catch these kinds of things if you look at all the the translations next to each other. You'll see the outliers. Sometimes the NASB may get it here, and sometimes it may be another one here. But I tend to lean towards those two translations. But ultimately, if I really want to go deep for those that are motivated, put the verse into the search bar and type the word Greek if it's in the New Testament, or type the word Hebrew if it's in the Old Testament next to the verse, and it'll pull up Bible Hub and will give you literally word by word the Hebrew of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, or the Greek of the New Testament that corresponds with that English word. And you can do deep dives into the meaning of each word by clicking on the link and really dive into the weeds on it. I have numerous examples of times where I've done this on a verse and just had the most epic of epiphanies about how I've misunderstood a text. So that's typically what I recommend. And then if you really want to go deep, start looking into the Hebrew Matthew and the church fathers and all of those, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole show that I could do with you just talking about church fathers and extra biblical texts. There's only so much time in the day, but I agree with you as far as like beware of the NIV, because they do add in stuff and omit stuff. The whole prayer and fasting in Matthew and Mark doesn't have the word fasting, and it doesn't even have the entire verse was taken out of the NIV in Matthew when they mentioned prayer and fasting.
Right.
And then I also look up the interlinear. So I don't necessarily type Hebrew or Greek, because if I'm not sure what language it was in originally, I'll just type in, Mark 9:29 interlinear, and it pulls up Bible Hub. The first hit is, the original Greek, and you can go word by word, like you said, and really look into it. Yeah, I would also just echo that statement that you said of look up various translations. That's really helped me as well. Mm-hmm. I found one example here in Hosea where it says, in the KJV, it says, you shall no more call me Baal or Bali, but in the NIV, it says, instead of Baal, it's my master. So it cloaks and changes some of the names of these lowercase g gods that people are sacrificing to and things like that. And I find a greater amount of depth in the KJV because there's just more detail. And, but I'm not going to say that KJV is the best either, because sometimes you just have to look at other translations and just compare them and see what you find for yourself.
Well, the one thing I do love about the KJV is that Old English uses the word meat everywhere, all over it, including Genesis 1:29, where it says that herbs and fruit-bearing seeds shall be yours for meat. Because often people who are rebuttaling my points online will pull from the KJV some verse about meat, and 9 times out of 10, it's not even talking about animal flesh. So you can show, this word has just been mistranslated. It's a euphemism. It's lost its meaning over time, and it actually just meant food. And really, if you go back to Genesis 1:29, our meat was meant to be plants. And I love the KJV for that. And like you said, I read it a lot because of some of the nuances that are going on in there. What I would also say too, I'm glad you brought up the whole specific interlinear besides just Greek or Hebrew, because number one, you may not be aware of what it was written in. Number two, outside of even the Greek and Hebrew, we got to look into translations at times. Case in point, again, bringing up this famous Jeremiah 7:22 passage. If you include the verse before 7:21, right, he famously says, go ahead, have your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and eat the meat yourselves. And then he goes on to say, for I never spoke to your fathers commanding. And people will often throw that out to me. You're not reading the second half of 7:22, thinking that it's like God commanding the Israelites to eat meat. But it's, number one, clearly an ironic, rhetorical statement where he's like, go ahead, eat the sacrifices, eat the meat, see what happens, is what he's saying, right? But here's the really interesting piece. In the Peshitta, which is the Aramaic version of the Hebrew Bible, specifically translated by George Lamza. Anyone can type it in. You can even type it in right now if it's quick enough. But Lamza translates Jeremiah 7:22, and it says, go ahead, eat the meat yourselves, which I did not command your fathers to eat. For I did not speak to your fathers concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices when I brought them out of Egypt. Right? So he apparently either has additional context based on the Aramaic translations, because he's translating from the Syriac. For those who don't know, Syriac is a sister language to Aramaic. And in the East, when Christianity was spreading, the Syriac church wrote all of its scriptures in Aramaic. And there are certain preserved sayings in the Aramaic that aren't preserved in our Bibles that are written in Greek because the translation error from one language to another, right? Another famous example, again, with the meat is the divided gospels, or the Evangelion de Mempharshe, or however you pronounce it. It's the Syriac gospels. There's a passage, Luke 21:34, which in our Bibles, in the Greek, says, be aware, do not let your hearts become heavy with drunkenness, dissipation, and the anxieties of the world, this famous saying of Jesus. Well, in the Greek, funny enough, dissipation is like a redundancy from drunkenness, because it's essentially just talking about a hangover is kind of what dissipation means. It's a really weird word that almost is hardly ever used too, which makes it an outlier. Clearly, it might be covering up something. Well, funny enough, when you go to the Aramaic Peshitta, Luke 21:34 says, be aware, do not let your hearts become heavy or hardened by the drinking of wine or intoxicants, the eating of flesh, specifically the Aramaic word flesh, and the anxieties of the world, because those days will come upon you like a snare, right? This is the famous saying of Jesus. So it preserves this earlier reading. And interestingly, that earlier reading of that text matches not only the Old Testament in Proverbs, where it says, don't associate with those who are drunk and eating flesh, but it adds the word gluttony, gluttonous flesh eaters. In the Peshitta, the Aramaic version, it says, don't associate with those who drink intoxicants and eat flesh. No gluttony. It's not about those who overeat flesh. It's just those who eat flesh. So it's important to go into the Aramaic tradition, and you see these additional details that even get lost in the Hebrew and Greek, right? Because it's Jesus's mother tongue.
Absolutely. It's so important to read as many translations as we can, and the oldest translations that we can. God willing that they're preserved, because a lot of them have been lost to time.
Right.
Now, Cam, do you have a favorite chapter of the Gospel of Matthew? Because I read that gospel so many times, and there's so many just gold mines in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, like, I have a couple favorite chapters. I'm wondering if you do personally.
Yeah, I agree with a couple. I don't know if I could do one. I can give you a couple. For sure, the Beatitudes. I mean, since I was a kid, I mean, who doesn't just hear those words and just get floored? Speaking of anxieties of the world, in that last chapter, look at all the birds of the field and the flowers of the field. They don't labor and spin. You know, don't worry for tomorrow, because tomorrow has enough worries for itself. That passage has probably permeated my being in ways that I couldn't even articulate with words. So I'm not going to try. My life, I feel so grateful that even in the hardest and most challenging of circumstances, I'm able to mitigate anxiety, which is a big challenge for a lot of people in the world. And I think it's because that phrase just really percolated in my being from a really young age. Like, dude, look at what Jesus is saying. I had, like, any time from the youngest age that a worry would come up, I would just hear that, you know, like, don't do it. That it's worthless. Worry just adds to a problem that you already have. Just solve the problem, right? So that's a big one, the Beatitudes. It goes on to say so many more beautiful things. I love the antithesis that's included off the back end of that, right? Your law says this, but I say this, right? And why I like that is because specifically Jesus points out, your law says don't kill, but I say don't even hate your brother, right? And he says, your law says don't commit adultery. I say don't even lust in your heart. Interestingly, that was a massive revelation for me when I was studying the famous Moses scroll, the Shapira document, the original potential Deuteronomy that was deemed to be a forgery. Whole other podcast we could probably have on that. It's my next project. It's a Deuteronomy that's devoid of animal sacrifices. That was a Dead Sea Scroll document found almost a century before the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it looks like it's a real document, and all the critical biblical scholars are beginning to agree. That document, not only does it not contain the sacrifices, but in the 10 Commandments and the blessings and curses all preserved together, which Deuteronomy does not in our Bible, it says to not only do not kill, but it says don't hate your brother in your heart. That's actually the 10th commandment in this 10 words. And it says not only do not commit adultery, but do not commit lust, or do not covet your neighbor's wife in your heart, is what it says. And so to me, that points to a potential connection between this Nazarene idea that these Nazarenes had a legislation, but a different one, maybe something more like, or even this document that's being uncovered as we speak right now. And here he is in our Gospels orating as if he's orating from that law. So I love that one. I also love his rebuke of the woe to you scribes and Pharisees, right? I mean, talk about an epic throwdown, because it's always, for me as a child and growing up in my tradition, pretty easy to connect to the hippie peace, love, and happiness Jesus. As I've gotten older and grown into my manhood and had to have moments in my life where I need to like increase my gusto and convictions and boundaries around certain things, it's been a challenge at times for me, because I feel this dichotomy between wanting to be quote unquote Christ-like, which in my subconscious is just super kind, but then that comes to the point of almost being a pushover if you're not careful, right? To stand in on business. And that's what he's doing in the woe to you scribes and Pharisees, echoing that tradition of Jeremiah, calling them out for the scribal errors, is what I think he's doing in this passage, because he's saying traditions of men, right? He's talking about the traditions of men, which is to me the sacrifices. And you have to read between the lines sometimes in our Greek Gospels, because not only is there the translation issue, but you got to realize these documents were written way later after Jesus, way later after the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which is very clear on this subject of sacrifice. They muddy the waters a little bit, but it's still there if you look. And specifically in that section, Jesus says, woe to you scribes, you Pharisees, you're like whitewashed tombs. You're beautiful on the outside, but inside you're full of, and our English translations will also often say the bones of the dead, or bones of dead people. But there's no Greek word in there that indicates people. The word is singularly necron, which just means corpses. And it's the same word used when talking about the corpse of an animal. And I lend to believe that he's talking about animals, because what's the issue in Mark 7? And I forget the Matthew parallel, but the whole ritual hand washing, God's made all foods clean debate that we get into often when we talk about this. People who know their Bible will say, well, God, Jesus said he declared all foods clean, when he was debating the Pharisees. But it's really, there was a ritual hand washing issue that the Pharisees are complaining that the disciples aren't washing themselves before they're eating traditionally. It's kind of a rebuke against germs or something. I don't know, an ancient idea of germs or defilement. And Jesus is saying, hey, it doesn't matter. What goes into you doesn't poison you. It's what comes out of you. But he's not talking about the literal contents of the food. He's talking about the food being defiled by the contamination of unwashed hands. Then the scribes, the lying pen of the scribes, went into those verses. And if you open your Bible right now, whatever the translation is, go to Mark 7, read this story. And at the end, in parentheses, it'll say that when Jesus said, it doesn't matter what comes into you, it's what goes out. It says in parentheses, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. But all of our modern Bibles put it in parentheses because they have to truthfully indicate that this is a scribal editorial note late in the tradition, in late, almost like a scribe writing in the margins. Oh, this is what Jesus meant by saying that. But he didn't mean the foods, he meant the defilement. So I link, to wrap this all together, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but inside you're full of corpses. I think it's a part of that same rebuke. Hey, you're washing your hands and you're doing this ritual about all your purity, but you're eating blood sacrifice, right? So that's why I love that passage in Matthew. But I could go on and on. It's hard to choose, but those are my three. What's yours? I want to hear yours.
Thank you. No, that was amazing. Mine, chapters 6 and 7 are epic. 6 has pray in secret. If you don't forgive others, your Father won't forgive you. He mentions cleanliness, fasting in secret. You can't serve two masters, and take no thought for your life. And so that's all in chapter 6. So that one has some heavy, very potent teachings in it. And then 7, I believe it. If we were to find the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew 7 that we have today is probably, much of it's going to be in this old Hebrew Gospel, because it just has that ancient truth like resonating through it. Judge not lest ye be judged, right? Look at yourself first. Don't cast pearls before swine. Seek and you shall find. It has the golden rule. Treat others as you wish to be treated. Don't treat others the way you do not wish to be treated. Right after that, this very next verse, he says, narrow is the way, and teaches the two ways. He also says, beware false prophets. You'll know them by their fruits, and ends Matthew 7 with works over faith. And so to me, that's just the most potent chapter. It has the most core teachings of how to live as a human being on this planet. And it's got a lot of the stuff that we discussed today.
Wow, that's powerful. I'm gonna go read it from. I know all the passages, but now you've got me wanting to read it sequentially and think about what you just said about the potentiality of it being lifted from, or at least influenced by, that original Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Because I can totally see that, especially with the culmination of the two ways, because we know that was a big conversation in the Dead Sea Scroll documents of these tradition, which are the oldest, documents we have of this tradition, heavy on the two ways. Same in the Didache, the first century teaching of the 12, right? That we know is very, very early church liturgy. This two ways concept is massive. So it would have to be a core piece to what was said, but so beautiful. I mean, it's like circling back to your point of just how going down this path and asking these questions can be deemed heretical. It's unfortunate, because the deeper I go and the more I question, to the point of even, questioning some of these things like infallibility and everything in my life, I've only gotten closer to the teachings. Like, they resonate and inform my life in an even deeper way. And you find that, like you just said, that the most resonant and the most applicable and the most powerful of teachings typically do go back to the earliest sources. They're often the most terse too, the terse sayings, the simple to the point. Judge not lest ye be judged. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I mean, it doesn't get any more simple than that, yet so profound, because Jesus sums all the law and the prophets up in it. Love God, love others. Don't do to someone else which you would not want done to yourself, and do to others which you would want, done to yourself. And that philosophy, you can hang your whole hat on that philosophy and have a really good life.
Yeah. I also find that this is bringing me closer to God. The more I learn about the Bible, the more I read the Bible, the more I learn how a lot of it's not even true, and later edition, it's like, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's helping us separate the wheat from the chaff and find the truth and be able to just hone in on the truth. I've had friends say to me like, oh, Seth, you're talking a lot about Jesus. Like, I'm kind of worried about you. I'm like, you're worried about me treating others better? You're worried about me being more forgiving? You're worried about me like baptizing myself and just, getting closer to God and like following these ways and trying to live the way of life over the way of death? Like, if that worries you, then that's okay. I mean, that's your prerogative, but don't worry, I'll be fine.
Totally. On that separating too, there's a whole other 30 minutes of this podcast. We could talk about the tradition that goes into the Ebionite Nazarene tradition that these church fathers talk about, the Clementine literature, this idea of separating the truth from the fiction in the scriptural material that goes back all the way to these traditions doing that. But even going back further, again, taking it back to Jeremiah, we already talked about 8 verse 8, the lion pen of the scribes, but Jeremiah also famously talks about separating the sacred from the profane. And the way it's really kind of rendered in that section 2 is separating the pearls from the profane. And it's escaping me right now. There's more context to that scripture that makes it that much more powerful, but go look it up for yourself. But when you think about that whole don't cast your pearls before swine, even, and Jeremiah alluding to that with the pearls over the profane, it's like, in some ways we're separating. We know, because Jeremiah says that they added, not only that the lion pen of the scribes falsify the Torah, he also says in another passage, they have added violence to the Torah, Hamas, violence to the Torah. I believe it's Ezekiel says the same thing. They've added violence to the Torah. And people try to render that as they've violated the Torah, like in their lifestyle. The Torah is what it is with all the liturgical laws and all the stuff, but they violate it through their lifestyle. But when you read the Hebrew, it's very clear that they've added or done violence to the Torah, meaning they've mutilated the Torah violently, but they've also added literal violence to it. The blood ritual sacrifice situation and all the genocide of the other tribes and all of this, right? So they're calling that out way back then. But it's interesting you bringing up the casting your pearls before swine, because in that same idea, it's almost like it makes me think of when you do find those treasures in the truth of those scriptures and you present them. I'm not going to call others swine and awesome. Obviously I think pigs are awesome. They're super smart, but getting at what that probably oral tradition passed down over time and twisted and corrupted is, it's saying, don't be careful not to present these sacred findings before people who aren't ready to listen, because you're going to implode the situation and you're going to, so maybe there's something to that as well.
Yeah. And it's not calling other people pigs. It's just an analogy where, like, pigs don't have any use for pearls. They're just going to step all over them and break them. And so that, as an analogy, people take this information and they just literally don't know what to do with it and will, like, flippantly kind of just break it or step on it or whisk it out of the way and not treat it the way that you're treating it, which is like with care and sort of deep critical analysis and thought.
Yeah. That's a great flip on that. Thanks for, that frames it better.
Yeah. Well, for a while, I didn't even know what pearls before swine meant. I think I had to look it up. I was like, oh, the pigs will just step on the pearls and break them. That's literally what it comes from. So you just brought up the, you mentioned the Clementine literature and also the Didache. From those two texts, what I have found is a lot of the history and the practices of baptism and water. So I'd like to I got a couple more questions left for you. Your name is Kameron Waters. So you got Waters right in your name. People have even called you the John the Baptist of this Nazarene movement, of this new movement we have today of people waking up to this old history. But I want to bring up the idea of water. And my question is, do you find God's energy in living water? Because I think that's kind of what I get from the Didache and the Clementine literature and even the Bible. There's so many allusions to living water. So before I hand it to you, let me just read a couple passages. Deuteronomy 8 discusses, the Lord bringing people into a good land, a land of brooks and water, fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills. In addition to the land that flows with milk and honey, spring water is very important. Psalm 23, which is the famous psalm people use to literally exorcise demons out of people. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. That very next phrase, he restores my soul. Jeremiah 2:13, right? People have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Jeremiah uses water a decent amount. In chapter 17, he discusses the fountain of living water again. Heal me, O Lord, and I shall be healed. right after he mentions the fountain of living water as God himself. And of course, in John, we see it a lot, a well of water springing up into everlasting life. We see it in Revelation all over the place, the fountain of living waters. Let him take the water of life freely. And of course, just the practice of baptism, which is what Jesus and John the Baptist were doing for thousands and tens of thousands of people at the time. I want to know from you, like, what is your idea of baptism? And also, I'm aware that it's not just a one-time thing with the Essenes, the Ebionites, that they baptized regularly. It was a daily thing. And in the Travels of Peter, the Clementine literature, he talks about that as well. Morning, daily baptisms. So, Cam, in your view, in your opinion, do you find the essence of God in the living waters? And what is the role of baptism?
Wow, so much to say to all of that. Firstly, I appreciate the John the Baptist comment. That's a tall order. If anything, I'm the one shouting out in the wilderness, looking like a crazy person. I just hope that I don't end with my head on a platter. That's the thing I'm trying to avoid. But no, I do relate to John the Baptist a lot. And I'll get to some other stuff out because I want to stay on the baptism piece, but there's a lot of things about John the Baptist that's really worth exploring in this whole conversation that we've been having today, outside of even just baptism. But yeah, the living waters is absolutely, I think, like the pinnacle metaphor and reality of experience of God. And I think back to my childhood before I had any of these revelations about returning to the Edenic ideal and, this historical movement and everything. There's all the little seeds that were planted early on, learning thou shalt not kill and some of these principles in a mental state, right? But when I went to the mountains with my family, I was probably about somewhere between 7 to 10 years old. I can't remember, but I did my first plunge into some cold water with a waterfall coming down in the mountains, like freezing cold water. And my grandfather was making a big deal out of it and, kind of calling it a polar plunge or whatever, a long, 8 years old, way before the ice bath craze and all that. And I was so hesitant to do it, right? I'm scared because I'm just a little kid and I know it's cold. But he jumped in and he came out and shook off like a polar bear and was making all these funny faces, and he encouraged me, and I went in and I did it. And I, to this day, will never forget that feeling. It's like it's yesterday. I came out and I was so struck by how amazing I felt. If anyone's been in cold water for a little while, especially if it's really cold, you can hesitate and you can be a little, resistant to it, but you're so grateful you did it afterwards because you come out insanely refreshed and renewed. It's like your eyes are brighter, your head is more clear. It just, not only from the shock does it kind of clear your thoughts because you have to focus in on that experience that you're having. You're going under where you have no breath, so you come up to catch your breath again. I think there's something to that. But ultimately, water is life, right? Everything on our planet that's living requires water. We're made primarily of water, especially our brains are like 98% water or something, 97% water. And anything long enough, and it's not really that long, without water dies. So there is this direct connection to God. It says in the beginning, right? We talked about the creation narrative. You mentioned the creation, the waters dividing, but remember the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I remember when I used to hear that at church when I was a kid, I would think about myself because of my last name. And it would kind of like trip me out, like, oh, is God hovering over me? But it says the Spirit, and I also use it now for surfing. I love to surf. So I'm like, yo, God was surfing from day one. He was hovering over the waters. But I still have that same communion with surfing, with going in. And just today, this morning, I went here in Costa Rica. Thankfully, I'm so grateful and blessed. I'm able to drive down the road and there's a waterfall, and I make it a daily practice, and it does renew me. I think there's a deeper liturgical how do you say it, ritualistic thing that you can get into and get involved with the Clementine literature, the Didache and the prayers. I simply say the Lord's Prayer a lot. I say my own free-flowing prayers as well too when I'm in the water. I always try to pray when I'm in the water because, as we know, water has memory and it amplifies in its structure the thought forms of humans around it. And so I always like to think my prayers are being amplified in the water, but I traditionally love to just, do a Lord's Prayer, ask for forgiveness, forgive others, ask for my daily bread. And I dunk myself a few times, and it's gotta be, other than my diet and my sustenance, or alongside, my most consistent ritual practice in my spiritual walk is making sure that I get in some living water everywhere. And those verses were all amazing that you just shared. I love the streams of living water will flow from their belly, idea from Jesus. And I think there's something to that as well, that we could get into, probably a whole other, again, podcast. But to me, it has to do a lot with the belly as well, like literally the belly and what we take in and the hindrance that we create from living water flowing from us versus the opening the spigot.
And if I'm not mistaken, you are a Virgo sun sign, is that right?
Yeah.
And Virgo, well, every zodiac sign is associated with the body part. Virgo is the belly or the guts. They're known for their intellect and being able to digest information. That's what Virgos are known for, so to digest and to sort of, the gut is a good example, a good symbol of that, because it's the thing breaking down all the food and turning it into information for the body. So that's interesting that you had a resonance with the stream of living water coming from the belly of Jesus as well. So, Cam, there's so much I want to ask. We could go off on the Moses-spiracy, on Marcion. We could go off on just so much, but I think we're going to have to save it for another time. I did want to ask you about the Beagles. Can we just get a quick update? This will be maybe our last question. You were recently involved as a press role, taking photos and documenting an animal rescue operation at Ridgeland Farms. Could you tell us a little bit about the status of that? I heard that a lot of the dogs got freed because of that. So I'd love to just get a quick fill in and a follow up. And if we can get more information, please share that.
Absolutely. Well, again, just for a little context, off the back of this conversation we've had about Yeshua, Jesus, standing up against the temple animal sacrificial system in such a bold way and trying to abolish it, that idea has become an extension in my own life in connecting the dots that some of the most Christ-like people on the planet are direct action animal liberators that are going into slaughterhouses, animal testing facilities, you name it, putting their lives on the line to stand up against these institutions and saving animals primarily, which is what Jesus did when he freed the animals from the temple, as John explicitly says, and the other gospels allude to, and even state with the birds, right? But the same way Jesus was convicted and crucified for this act, modern scholars agree, it was this act that was able to get him legally, convicted. That's still happening today. And there are animal rights groups around the world who are taking direct action to go liberate animals from these horrific factory farm conditions or animal testing facilities. And historically, and by historically, I mean the last, century or more, or whatever, that this has been happening, they've been persecuted for it. And most drastically since the Patriot Act after 9/11, when the government formed the Patriot Act and created the domestic terrorist list, animal activists made the top of the list. Interestingly, some of the most peaceful, loving people who have never committed an actual crime or harm to anyone in the process of doing this. In fact, there are activists who have been taken to prison for writing animal liberation slogans on the sidewalk in chalk in one instance. It's insane. But typically, they're charged with with felony burglary or conspiracy or whatever they can get them on, because they're breaking into a facility, but to rescue animals in danger. And there's this concept called right to rescue, which is legally supported in the courts if fought properly, because the same way that, say, a child is in a household and it's being abused or exploited or harmed, someone breaking into that household to rescue the child is not going to get charged with felony burglary or the things that can come along with just breaking into a house to steal something, right? There's justification there. There's the same justification when argued properly in the courts, but it's a whole process. So bottom line, circling back to the Beagles, this particular group, Direct Action Everywhere, that was founded by Wayne Shung, and he now has a new project as well called Simple Heart, where he's partnering still with Direct Action and a couple of other animal liberation groups to focus on animal testing, because there's been a lot of work done on slaughterhouses, and there will continue to be a lot. But the fact of the matter is, public opinion is that much more on the side of ending animal testing, because everyone agrees that it's an archaic, barbaric, unnecessary practice. We've got alternatives. And let's just be frank, the testing on puppies and, primates is shocking for people. People can relate or have more affection for the puppies and the primates than maybe they can for some of the farmed animals in the other cases, right? So there's been a lot of focus put on this to help, just to know that this is, for lack of better words, low-hanging fruit in terms of helping animals on a mass scale. We can really do something about this. So I joined the forces with the teams planning this rescue of the Ridgeland Beagles. A little backstory on Ridgeland. They're a facility in Wisconsin, a breeding facility primarily, but they do animal testing there as well. And they had, at the time that we interacted with them in the last months, about 2,000 beagles still in their breeding facility after the facility had said publicly and in court that they were going to shut their breeding facility down. The reason why they said that is because Wayne and a few of the individuals had already been to the facility, documented some of the abuses, actual legal abuses that have been happening there, animal cruelty under law. For instance, some of the beagles were being tested on in this procedure called cherry eye procedure, where their eyes are being prodded and surgically mutilated without anesthesia. So it's already bad enough to be doing it, but legally you have to use anesthesia for these dogs. And they were doing it without anesthesia. Not only that, they were just hiring regular employees with no background in any kind of veterinary practice to do these procedures, which is highly illegal. And a couple of undercover investigators, one of them in which got a job for months and had to subject himself to the cruelty there in order to investigate and prove what was going on, did this. And all of this was presented to the courts a couple of years ago, and the courts ruled in favor of the activists and said, hey, yeah, this is illegal. And there was a potential felony that was going to happen towards Ridgeland Farms. But Ridgeland Farms and their lawyers and their corporate interests were able to get out of that and said, hey, look, we're going to just, spank on the wrist. We'll shut the facility down, and that's it. And then after the dust settled, they just didn't shut the facility down yet. They said that they were going to do it next month in July, but come March and April of this year, or came in March and April of this year, they were still doing it. There were 2,000 dogs there screaming for their lives. They're in these tiny cages. Their paws are constantly irritated by the bottoms of these wire cages all the time. They don't have a soft place to lay down. They're all scared. They're under LED lights all day. So a bunch of activists said, we're not going to wait for them anymore. This is our chance to show the world like that we have a right to rescue. The court has already said that these guys are basically felons, and everyone's dragging their feet, and we're not going to do it anymore. So like you said, I went to go document as press a direct action animal rescue, probably one of the biggest to date at any facility like this. And once I got indoors and saw what the dogs were in, I couldn't help myself. I threw my camera to the side and grabbed a dog and ran out with one and helped a dog get free, because she was cowering in the corner, and here I was with two hands and I'm documenting it, but I'm like, is the footage the most important or is the dog most important? So I got a dog out of there, and then the police descended on the complex. They started arresting everybody. I was able to get free, thankfully, because I appeared to be press. I was wearing my press badge and all of that, but I was able to rescue two dogs in a Tesla front trunk because they were literally confiscating dogs. We rescued 30 of them and they took 8. The police did. They confiscated. I like to say they arrested the hostages rather than the actual criminals who were the people running the facility. But thankfully, 2 of the dogs were put in a Tesla in the heat of the moment when the cops were trying to grab. And I found myself synchronistically talking with the owner of this Tesla, not knowing that he had dogs in his car, but I was trying to use him as a getaway car to get out of there once the dust settled. And he said, bro, I got dogs in my car. I actually have all this on my YouTube channel. If you all want to go watch, I tell the whole story on my personal YouTube channel at Kameron Waters. But basically, we got the dogs in the front trunk, which is kind of a low-key place, because most people forget that the front is the trunk of the Tesla. So we were able to get out through the police checkpoint where they were investigating everyone going through, and got those dogs to safety. We got 20. So in total, 22 dogs were brought to safety, and it went nuclear viral on social media. I had no idea it was going to go so viral, really, to be honest, but everybody started talking about it. One of the rescuers was Alexandra Paul, who's famous for being on Baywatch. So she brought some extra attention as well with her celebrity, and it caused a big stir. And while the news cycle was as hot as it could be, we started planning to do a second one, because all we could think about was there's still, almost 2,000 dogs in that facility, and we got to get them out. So Wayne and the team leaders all pulled together what does seem like has to be the biggest direct action animal rescue at a animal testing facility ever done. There was hundreds and hundreds of people that showed up. But the second time we went, I also went to document, and the facility was really prepared. They had hired private security. They had much more police ready to go. And essentially all of the activists were met with like chemical warfare, essentially, when we got there. They had dug ditches around the entire facility and put massive hay bales to try to block. And inside the ditches was feces. It was filled with feces of what was probably like cow feces, because it was so much of it, but there was probably dog feces in there as well from the facility, which is actually now a class action lawsuit against the facility, because that's highly illegal. It's a biohazard. These dogs and animals, they can give you I forget the term, but it's a disease that you can get from the feces, like a common disease. They also put barbed wire all around the moats and everything that they built. Then, if that's not enough, everybody pressed forward, and the activists, and rescuers were going in regardless of all that, climbing through the moats and doing everything to get to the dogs. They were met with the private security who had liquid mace, smoke, not smoke bombs, but the tear gas, right? And even these canisters that they were shooting out of these cannons at people that exploded into these like lime green powdery substances. And again, I forget the name of it. Someone was able to figure out what it was, but it's actually an illegal, like it's deemed chemical warfare. It's illegal crowd control. And so they did all that on us. And then the police, not all of them, some of the police were good. I want to say that, by the way, because I'm never one that wants to like be one-sided on a story. There were a couple police that you could tell were there to do their jobs, and they were hating it. And they were coming and trying to help the rescuers and making sure everyone was safe and all that. But then some of the police were enjoying it and getting in on it. So it was kind of both. But needless to say, we didn't get any more dogs out of that attempt. just a lot of brutality, but worked in the favor of the mission again, because the brutality of the facility was broadcast on social media, and it caused an uproar as well. And essentially, a number of negotiations started. Laura Trump stepped in, funny enough, from down somewhat your way, big dog rescue, animal rescue outside of Palm Beach somewhere. She's got a big facility, and the main representative of that facility came up and put some pressure on as well, and got Laura to say some things. And once the dust from the chemical warfare settled, literally, the dogs were able to get, I think it was 500 were able to get out. And now there's still another wave coming out over time, and they're making their way to homes, forever homes all over the nation. And this is now a stepping stone towards the next target, which is Marshall Animal Testing Facility in upstate New York, which is what most animal rescuers and activists call the Death Star of animal testing. It's a massive facility with way more animals, dogs and pigs and ferrets, and like a ton of cats. They test on cats there. And it's horrific. So now everybody's kind of sights on that to use this energy and public support to now start trying to pressure them. And everybody wants it. I mean, you know, in the MAHA movement, even RFK's spoken out pretty heavy-handedly against animal testing, says that he's trying to work with NIH and whoever else to phase it out. The CDC's supposed to be phasing out animal testing. So I think we could see within our lifetime or shorter potential end to animal testing, which would be a massive, I mean, unprecedented win for the animals. So all that to say, I am, as we speak, I'm on the list of the sheriff that's been sent to the DA with potential, I'll say, charges of felony burglary and maybe felony conspiracy. That said, I don't think it's going to go through, God willing, because I think the public pressure and public opinion is a little too strong for them to pursue. They're ending the facility anyways. But I will say, man, Wayne and some of these other activists, I'm just so inspired by them because they're happy to get charged. They almost want to get charged and fight this in court because that's how you move the needle on policy. I'm not against getting charged, but I don't know that I'd say I'm happy about it because I have a family. I have a son. I don't want to risk. I mean, the charges for this stuff, it's like five years minimum in prison, something like that. So I definitely don't want to do that. So I'm praying to the Most High that I just skirt past the whole thing. But trying to do my part.
Wow. You certainly are doing your part. You put your life and career at risk, just getting up there on the front lines. But that's what Jesus did. He stormed the temple for a reason. We looked at today in our talk about how that might have been, if not the main reason, the reason that he was sent here to begin with was to interrupt that system. So I think you're doing God's work. He smiles on the work that you're doing, and he's got your back. You'll be fine. I do think it's amazing the amount of public support that we've seen now from this taking down these animal testing facilities. I see a lot of people on Instagram adopting these Ridgeland beagles, and you can see like the clips of the first time the beagles ever touch grass, or like first time that they're being touched without being hit or grabbed or treated, violently. It's a really beautiful thing to see. And you're totally right that people can turn a blind eye to slaughterhouses. But when it comes to animal testing, we kind of all know that that's messed up and needs to stop. And we would sign something that, petitions to stop it. Next step will be the slaughterhouses. So one step at a time in this world, we got to take things slow sometimes.
Yeah.
But, as the master teaches us, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is now or never. So, Cam, I just want to thank you, brother, for being on the show and offering your wisdom and your experience, your perspective, your voice. Thank you for Christspiracy. Thank you for continuing that work. And so maybe we'll be talking about the Moses-spiracy in a few years.
Yeah, it's in the works. Stay tuned. And thank you so much for all the work that you've done. And I'm so grateful to have been recognized on your channel with our film for the obvious reasons of we appreciate the recognition, but because it introduced us. And now we're able to chat with all the other NAS dogs out there about this research and continue to iron sharpen iron each other's perspectives on all this and get down to the root of the truth. And I love what you're doing so much. You know, I would say I'm an aspiring fruitarian. I was a fruitarian for 2 years. Right now, I'd say I'm probably around 70%, something like that. But maybe I'm in the raw till 4 camp or something, if you had to nail me down, because I typically eat just like this coconut is actually all I've had today so far, because I just eat light during the day anyways. But I typically, next I'll go into a smoothie or some fresh fruit or whatever. And then sometimes at night, you know, I try to do like a warmer meal of rice and maybe some potatoes and these kinds of things. It's just kind of where I've landed for other reasons we can talk about on another podcast. But I know and I appreciate and I believe in the power and the healing of fruit. And I'm really excited about everything that you've been working on with the Genesis 129 diet and the Fruit Companion and your magazine and everything. And it inspires me to keep pressing myself in that direction again, more and more, because ultimately, you know, it's funny. We talked about the living water. That's really the root of it all is hydration, right? And there's no place better and safer and sweeter to consume living water than in the fruits of our beautiful garden planet that we have. And I get so much joy out of taking in the crystalline light inside every one of them. And I feel the zap of energy. And I just really appreciate that you're bringing that message to the world. And I think the more fruit people eat, the more those codes they'll get. And the message won't even take words anymore at a certain point. Hopefully, with us having to debate and orate all this, it'll just be crystalline rebooting of the whole system through everybody's cleansing, you know, cleansing the body temple.
I'm so here for it. So here for it. All right, y'all. Thanks again. For people listening, if you want to stay in touch with Cam and hear more about the work he's doing, definitely check out, Christspiracy.com, but also The Way on School, SKOOL. The Way is his membership group that has a lot of courses in it, and we have regular conversations in the forum, just tossing ideas back and forth, sharing new videos that come out, sharing ideas and questions. Come join the group. Cam, thank you again so much for being here on Radical Health today.
Thank you so much, Seth. Next time, we'll go deeper if we can.
We will, for certain. Thanks for listening, y'all.